In this lesson, we're going to learn about the different explorations of the French, Spanish, and English, and the different cultural and political aspects that they brought to the New World. First, we're going to start with the Spanish, because the Spanish were the first to arrive in the Americas, and they were led, of course, the first person to arrive in the Americas was Christopher Columbus. And he landed down around here near Cuba and in islands called the West Indies. Now, once Columbus landed and they started to establish a foothold in the Americas, the Spanish led the exploration efforts of early Americas. The leaders of this exploration and colonization and conquering were called conquistadors. The conquistadors were the conquerors of the New World. They would claim large areas of Central and South America for Spain. Their primary purpose for being here was to look for gold, which they found in great numbers from the Aztecs and Incas, the natives that lived in Mexico, Central, and South America. But soon they started to set up encomiendas, which were large plantations on which they would grow cash crops, mainly tobacco and some sugar and other things that were valued by the world. Here is the armor of a Spanish conqueror. You may know some of these conquerors that I'm talking about. Some of these Spanish conquerors that I'm talking about, the most famous was Hernan Cortez. They also were led by a gentleman named Francisco Pizarro, just to name a few. Here were I believe these are Incas, just based upon the mountainous region in which they live, but they may be Aztecs. The Aztecs and the Incas were very wealthy in terms of having gold and other precious metals, and the Spanish would search for and eventually strong-arm that gold off of the Aztecs and Incas. Now, for our notes today, which is 812, which it says at the top of your paper, we are going to focus on the British, the French, and the Spanish colonization of the Americas. Now, today we're going to talk mainly about the Spanish, which the Spanish had their, it was that coat of arms that we saw earlier on their flag of this time period. So, the Spanish colonization of the New World led to the establishment of many things. Spain would eventually take over parts of, primarily they would take over Mexico, South America, most of these islands, California eventually, Florida, for a time Georgia, because that was what was known as Spanish Florida. And in these areas they would build many things. They would establish cities, they would establish universities religious places known as missions, where their primary goal was to convert the natives into the Catholic religion. I believe last year you learned about gold, glory, and God were motives of the Spanish for colonization. The God part of that being they were trying to convert people to the Catholic religion. They also brought their social class system, which last year you learned and probably know the most high level of the social class system, which was what? Hopefully it's in your brain. Yes, it starts with a P. It is the Peninsulares, the lowest part of the social class system being, of course, slaves and various others. Just offhand, I can remember Peninsulares were the top. Mestizos, I believe, were below them. Then there was mulattoes. Then there was slaves. So my chart's a little bit off. Also, in the lands the Spanish conquered, they established large farms called encomiendas. These were large plantations where they grew tobacco, and of course the Spanish used slave labor, which, let's go ahead and label some of these on our maps. Let's just put some U's for universities, some C's for cities. Let's draw a couple missions. You can still view these out in California quickly. We'll draw a few of these because the Spanish brought all of these ideas and institutions with them to the New World, which most of the Spanish possessions, once again, were, and if you have a colored pencil, go ahead, shade in the Spanish color. I may add more to another map. They brought these things, these missions, these cities and universities to the New World, which they were conquering. Once again, though, their primary motive for being here was to attain gold from the native peoples of the New World. Now, once again, these encomiendas, which we talked about just a second ago, they were large plantations where the Spanish would raise cash crops, another way of them increasing their world power and wealth. Now, at first, the Spanish provided labor using this means of labor. They enslaved the natives, and this worked for a while, but soon the natives started to die off. Soon, two things causes the natives to perish. And you probably know what one of those things are. And I feel bad making my native here pass away from the work that he did on the Spanish plantation. But what were those two things that caused the natives to pass away? Initially, the Spanish made the natives slaves, but this didn't last that long because there was a silent killer that would kill the natives. And this was a most gruesome way to perish, and this silent killer was really tiny. And maybe, I believe some of you have already mentioned what it was, and you would need a microscope, and many of you have already told me that it was a disease, a particular disease, smallpox. So soon after the Spanish made the natives as slaves, disease and also the overwork that was demanded by the Spanish conquistadors and the people they left there to enforce this work it decimated the Native American population, which means it killed many of them. So the Spanish turned to a different form of labor, and these people actually had immunity to the disease that killed the natives, and these people were the African slaves, which of course came across on the Middle Passage. So at first, Native Americans were used as slaves, but because they lacked immunity to disease, they perished from the smallpox that the Spanish were unknowingly carrying with them. The Spanish also conquered and brought their missions, social class system, cities, universities, and encomiendas to parts of South America. Spain controlled a great deal of this area. Portugal also would control some of this area, which we learned, you should have learned last year. Portugal colonized Brazil, and they were very much like the Spanish in that they enslaved the natives as well. So, here's some parts of the PowerPoint where we have the Spanish, which, once again, it emphasizes what I just showed you with the drawing. They used the natives as slaves, but disease and overwork soon decimated or destroyed their population. So they had to turn to African slaves to work the plantations and the mines. I forgot that part. They also put the Native Americans at work in gold mines. Some of the Spanish accomplishments were they built cities, they established universities, they brought that social class system I was talking about. They brought their style of government, which a review from last year, what was the Spanish governor that was in place of the king over here? Perhaps you know it was called a viceroy, viceroyalty, like a vice president. And they brought the Catholic religion, which was the purpose of the missions that they developed. They first explored and claimed the islands south of Florida, but then they extended their search for gold and claims in North America. They settled Florida, the southwestern parts of the continent, and missions along the Pacific coast, which we can all see in this picture. The Pacific coast, this is the Pacific Ocean. So, along the Pacific coast, this of course is the Atlantic. Now, one word I forgot to mention was the motives. The motives are the reason. Motives are talked about by police officers when they're investigating a crime. And they'll be like, what was the motive for this crime? And that's the reason, the underlying reason. The motives of the Spanish were largely to search for gold or to grow cash crops. And there also was that additional motive of gaining Catholic converts for the Catholic Church. So the motives of each, the British, French, and Spanish, were different. Now we're going to talk about the French. And the French, the motives of the French were different than the motives of the Spanish. We're also going to talk about where the French settled. Now, while the Spanish settled most of South and Central America, the French would settle parts of Canada, Louisiana down here, and right here, also a part of Canada as well. So, now, the French settlement of the Americas, or claim for land, first started when the French sailed the St. Lawrence River and claimed parts of the land to its shores for themselves. The French, English, and Spanish colonization, though, was very competitive. The English ended up, I'm going to bring my knowledge of Ohio here. The English ended up with Ohio and Pennsylvania, but before that, the French had sailed down the Ohio River, which this is just some extra knowledge because I know this, and they claimed parts of the Ohio River. They actually put these lead plates in the ground that I learned about. Now, those were since dug up, and the English claimed the areas that the French formerly claimed, but the French also lost some of their claims in the French-Indian War. Okay, back to the early French claims. The first French claim started with the St. Lawrence River, and they're claiming of two Canadian provinces today, Quebec and Montreal, for France. This is why today Quebec and Montreal, they speak French. Quebec and Montreal are in this general area here. Now, the French colony was Catholic, and there were no French Protestants allowed. Later on, some French Protestants come to South Carolina and establish a colony that was successful for a short period of time, but ultimately was unsuccessful. Now, the relationship that the French had with the natives was quite different than that of the British and Spanish. The French really were not looking to enslave the natives and were not looking to claim land and start up cash crop growing businesses in the Americas. And because the natives saw the French as a much less of a threat, they had friendly relations with them. And the French's main way of making money was through trade with the Native Americans who would provide furs. The French had a, let's see, how do you say that? A monopoly on the fur trade because of their good relations with the Native Americans. I like to say the French and the natives were friends, because French and friend goes together. The French had friendly relations with the natives, and this was mainly because the French were not interested in building these settler colonies, these settlements where they were going to try to take over the natives' land. The French built what was called a trading post empire, where they had trading posts where they traded with the natives for furs, but they did not try to overreach into the natives' land. I'm going to shade some of the French colonies, what they claimed as their own. Although they had a good relationship with the natives, a light blue. Put a light blue color here next to the French. This is if you have colored pencils. Now, while the Spanish motives were to search for gold and make money by growing cash crops with slave labor, the French motives were, one, to trade, and they had an additional motive, which I don't believe you've ever heard of. The French were searching for an imaginary waterway through the Americas that was supposed to exist. This imaginary waterway. And they thought they found it many times. Because when they first discovered America, when the Spanish first discovered America, they had no idea that it looks like what it does. They figured there had to be a way around it or through it ultimately so they could get to where they were trying to get to in the first place, which was where? Yes, it was Asia. Now, because this waterway, the Europeans felt it had to exist, they gave it a name, and this name was called the Northwest Passage. The Northwest Passage was the name given to a waterway which must exist that would go through the Americas. The French motives one of the French motives were looking for this waterway, and they thought they found it many times. It does not exist. They sailed up the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi River is so gigantic, they thought they had found the Northwest Passage. They did not. They sailed up further and realized they were not coming out into another ocean. They sailed into some rivers here, the St. Lawrence River, I believe, but it could have been the Hudson River, and they ended up in the Great Lakes and thought they'd found the Pacific, but they had not found the Northwest Passage. So two of the motives of the French for exploring and building colonies in the Americas was to look for the Northwest Passage, and it was to maintain and build upon the fur trade that they had with the natives. Tomorrow we'll review some of this, and we'll also talk about the British motives, which were similar to the Spanish in that they were first here looking for gold, but they were unsuccessful in that enterprise. Until then, thank you for listening. I hope you did well.